are extraordinary scenes this lunchtime on one of Britain's major motorways.
This is the traffic jam from hell.
Thousands of motorists are stuck after spending the night in freezing conditions.
On January the 30th, 2003, thousands of people left home, never to make it back that night.
We've sat here for 17 hours. We have no information about what's happening.
There's been elderly people and children and possibly babies stuck on the roads around here since 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, which I find in the 21st century quite unbelievable.
What did it feel like to be trapped in the middle of this chaos? Why did it happen?
Cambridge's Star 107.9 at Real Music Variety. This is Freddie Shearer with you on Drive Time.
Every morning, we get up, get ready to go to work, and expect to get back again. January the 30th, 2003 was no different. Like millions of others, Emma in Newmarket got up and got on with the normal routine, planning her day so that she could be back home from the office by 6. The usual 3 million passengers jumped on the tube. Jag from Kingsbury was one of them. Leaving at 7 in the morning, he had confidently assured his wife he would be back by 8 at night for supper. At Britain's airports, business travellers were on their way, their next 24 hours meticulously scheduled. Everyone was secure in a technological world that promises to make journeys quick, comfortable, and weatherproof.
As you can see, up to 3 inches of snow expected to fall.
I haven't really noticed. It was one of those typical crisp days, I think. It was nothing. Got in the car, normal high heels. Didn't give it a thought.
And neither did the Cornell family in Cambridgeshire.
It's more especially around this southeastern corner, East Anglia. Brace yourself for around 3 inches of snow this afternoon.
These days, we bring our indoor world outside with us. And so the Cornell family piled into the car, radio on, heat up, not a care in the world.
The sun was shining, a few clouds in the sky. It was a real nice day.
And so it was. But in Britain, where we fill every inch of our routes, a change in the weather and our technological web can start to unravel. And a change in the weather was exactly what was forecast.
The way the forecast went out to the general public was fairly simple and straightforward. Cold, strong northerly winds, watch out for the snow.
Although the public may have missed the forecast, the men paid to keep Britain's roads moving had heard and thought they had heeded the warning. Ample supplies of salt for gritting were at the ready.
In preparation for the snow, the Eastern Counties agents were on full standby throughout the whole of Thursday morning. Indeed, some of our contractors had pre-salted their roads from early on the Thursday morning.
But there was one exception.
One of our contractors, however, decided to hold fire. And wind was very strong indeed. It was 50 miles an hour in some parts of East Anglia. And the roads were dry. And his worry was that if he had pre-salted, the vast majority of that salt would have blown clear of the road and would have been ineffective when the snow actually came.
So the gritters for key eastern roads were put on hold. At Stansted Airport, staff surveying the runways were not overly concerned, even when the snow started to fall.
I guess it was somewhere around 4:30 that I remember looking out the window and thinking, it's starting to snow.
And it started fairly innocuous, really. A few snowflakes coming down.
But at that stage, it was really just an inconvenience. It wasn't anything too major at that point.
None of Britain's airports warned travellers against travelling, and so the usual 500,000 passengers turned up at the airports.
Came into the airport, dropped me off, checked in, nothing to say that it was any delayed. It just said sort of waiting lounge, as they always say, waiting lounge.
I was told that my flight would still be leaving. I then checked in and I waited for my flight.
While passengers at Standstill were waiting for their flights, the gritters for many key southeastern routes were still sitting, tanked up with salt, and waiting for the wind to drop so they could get to work. Finally, the wind dropped, but so did the snow. Inches of it.
By about lunchtime, we found the snow showers that we talked about had actually turned up. Amounts of snow were beginning to look fairly dramatic for the southeast of England, up sort of 5 to 10 centimetres generally, and up to 15 centimetres in places from Cambridgeshire down through Hertfordshire in towards the M25.
The snow will keep falling for quite some time yet, and it will be bitterly cold overnight. The minimum...
Cambridgeshire was first in line, and soon even service stations were getting snowed under.
I had snow up here on the racks, and on the griddle there was a good 2 inches on the hot griddle, and that's when I decided to give up the battle, wash down and go home.
The trouble was, everyone else decided to go home too, even in London, where the snow had barely started to fall.
All of a sudden, his marshals were saying, this road is beginning to freeze, scramble the gritters now. And so he did scramble those gritters, but of course he had lost precious time. The problem then, of course, is that a lot of people were travelling on the highway, and when the snow started to fall, it was just like a cavalry charge of everybody zooming off from their offices, their cities and their towns onto the network.
And with that, accidents started happening all over the southeast.
On the A1101 at Shippey Hill, a van's upside down in a ditch whilst a car's in a field. Meanwhile, in Blundersham...
As cars ended up in ditches, one drive-time DJ decided to extend his show.
Good afternoon, this is Freddie Shearer with you on Drive Time, and a busy evening.
It was only a couple of hours into my shift that I realised that maybe it wasn't your average Thursday afternoon traffic jam. Certainly it was the volume of calls that we were getting. A lot of people saying that they were either stuck on the motorways and the main roads for several hours already. And also these stories of people not even being able to get off the roads, sliding back on the slipways, not being able to accelerate away. It was certainly showing that things were not quite as they were supposed to be.
All this came as something of a surprise to the police.
Where we're located, you can't see out of the building. So when we responded to the first accident about 1:15, we opened the doors to an absolute blinding blizzard, and we just had no idea that that was going to be there at all. And then we just started getting call after call after call.
Don't drive unless you have to. That's the message from Cambridgeshire Police following the snow showers. There's been several accidents already. The A14's been particularly affected.
The A14 was Paul's route home to Cambridge.
I joined the back of the queue, and it just seemed at the time you got the feeling that you weren't going to move very far very quickly. I decided to ring my wife. So I rang her and said, I'm really getting a feeling about this, that I'm not going to move. I might not even make it home tonight. And she said, don't be so ridiculous, and put the phone down. I think she thought I was going to nip into the pub on the way home or something. So from where she was, she just couldn't imagine that just say 20 or 30 miles away, there was actually a huge problem starting to happen.
In the capital, London Underground was building up its own problems. It was only 6 p.m. and already lines were failing.
I went over to my usual line that I usually take home on the Underground and found out that it just wasn't working because of the adverse weather conditions. So I decided to switch over onto this line.
Now on the Hammersmith and City line, Jag had to abandon the Piccadilly. The problem? Ice.
We have de-icing equipment on our trains, and those trains have started to lay de-icing. But the problem is de-icing is only really useful if you put it down in quantity before the rails start to ice.
This had been done in the morning, but by the end of the day it had been swept off. Not enough had been replaced and ice had formed. So why not de-ice the rails again? Well, if you wait until the afternoon, there's a problem.
Track staff finish in the day shift somewhere around about 4 o'clock, and the real big problem was that we tried to get emergency staff in later on in the evening, but they relied on mainly getting in either by train or by road transport. And because neither of the two were working, we then have a catch-22 situation.
The roads of London were slowing down, but in the southeastern counties, they were grinding to a halt. Serious gritting problems meant major routes were now covered in ice. Crucial parts of the M1, A14, and the M11 had not been gritted. And it was the M11 that had been precision bombed by the snow.
I saw a line in front and I thought, this could take a couple of hours instead of a planned hour and a half. And so I just stopped just beyond the Stansted exit and sat there.
Running between Essex and Cambridge, the M11 fell in the province of 2 police forces, their responsibilities dividing at Junction 9.
We only had that small snapshot of what we were dealing with, and I don't think any of us, none of us at all, none of the officers, knew just really how bad things were.
And the night was just beginning. By the afternoon of the 30th of January 2003, Britain's infrastructure had gone into shock as heavy snow started to fall, exactly as the weather forecast had predicted. Key roads had not received grit, nor rails antifreeze, and a snowbound gridlock of epic proportions was building. But it wasn't a blanket fall, and even late into the afternoon, Mike set off from Suffolk expecting to deliver his mushrooms as usual.
I'd set off, I'd driven for an hour and a half, no problems at all. Made one drop, run back to Bury, pick up the A14, and that's when I started to come across the ice, and the traffic just stopped.
Back on the London Underground, dozens of tubes had stopped, but only a handful of staff knew which ones.
A lot of our dot matrix information on platforms actually relies on the movement of trains. Now, if a train isn't moving, it will say that it's 1 minute, but it's going to say 1 minute forever until eventually the time wipes off. So the main problem we had was getting this information through to station staff so that they could tell customers.
Information was not getting through to JAG.
By the time we've directed people to connect with the Piccadilly line, that is not running. And of course they are assuming that you're giving them wrong information, which of course was right at the time you gave it.
But wrong by the time you implemented it. JAG kept trying to adapt, dodging blocked lines, broken trains, closed stations and platform stampedes. But after travelling for 3 hours, Jag ended up exactly where he started.
I figured I'd used about 3 different lines, trying to get to about 4 different stations, and all in all it took me about 3 hours, and I've ended up back here at Edgware Road.
But up-to-date information was in fact just at the end of the phone. Well, 2 phones.
A lot of the information comes from line control folks giving out information. There's only 1 or 2 telephone lines at that time in those control rooms, and every station on the line wants to know what's going on. We were relying on one person picking up a telephone and making a call to a station, putting the telephone down, making a call to another station. And that all takes time because the phone rings, the person on the platform realises the phone rings, because they're not sitting in offices, they're out on the platforms dealing with customers.
Meanwhile, those on the platform are trying to ring in.
The only way of getting information as to whether the Shilton line is running is to ring up Malvern and asking them. And to be quite honest, everybody's doing that.
Back out on the roads, the situation was getting worse.
Okay, so the A14, to the best of our knowledge, is looking like a bit of a no-go zone at the moment. So obviously the
But if you weren't tuned into local radio, you had no idea of what was going on.
Here's me stuck at the back of this queue, surrounded by hundreds if not thousands of vehicles. No one's moving. It's now snowing really hard, almost horizontal snow. It's building up and we're absolutely trapped, and there's not a word of advice coming from anywhere. Does anybody know how bad this situation is, and is anybody doing anything about it?
Certainly as the evening was progressing, we were getting so many more calls coming through. They were starting to seem like they were maybe not exactly panicking, but they were getting very, very stressed by this point.
I started to get really bored, and I hadn't even noticed, but I had no petrol left, which meant I had to switch off my engine, which meant I couldn't have the radio on, and I was getting really cold. So then, from then on, I think I started to think this is quite serious.
And it was. By early evening, the roads in the southeast of England were crammed with cars, and still the numbers grew. Emma's flatmate, Christine, had just joined the queue.
I don't think anybody had any control over the vehicles. They were just sort of sliding out to the outside lane and sliding back in again. So once we came to a halt, I, heaved a great big sigh of relief and thought, well, great, we'll have a break for a little while.
But for children, just being stopped was unnerving.
I suppose for a child, you're in a car, it's always moving unless it stops at traffic lights or a queue to go on holiday.
I couldn't see much. Everything was like white, and like the trees were white, they weren't green. The sky was black. It was very cold and fairly frightening because we didn't know what was going to happen.
Everyone was trying to find an alternative route to get home or to get to wherever their destination was. And a lot of that traffic did end up on the M11. And we just had total gridlock.
If the gridlock had started because the gritters had chosen the wrong time to grid, the airport was putting problems down to the wrong type of snow.
We knew we were going to get snow, why weren't we prepared for it? We were prepared for it, but obviously the sheer volume, and it sounds strange, but it all depends the kind of snow that you get. You get like a dry powdery snow in Scandinavian countries, and you can blow that off the runway. Here we tend to get like wettish snow which freezes, and then you get ice.
And I went down to the gate and I said to the girl, "Is this flight ever going to come, my flight?" And she said, I don't know, I can't tell you anything." With that, there was a moan from outside the gate. Up on the screen had come, "All flights cancelled."
It was unbelievable that nobody knew what was happening. People needed to know what was going to happen, how they were going to get to their destination.
It's very hard to give passengers concrete information. It's a what-if scenario. It's, well, maybe if it stops snowing and it doesn't get any colder, and maybe if the wind drops, we might be able to reopen later.
If at the airport the staff were keeping their options open, the police on the roads were seeing theirs dwindle away. Alan Jelly from Essex had come on duty at 6.
So we set off north on this side road, and on several occasions found that even ourselves became stuck. There were several points where I thought that we weren't going to move either. We had to spend half an hour at one point trying to dig our patrol car out. So we were just as stuck as everybody else, really.
And the numbers of those on motorways, slipways, A roads and B roads was growing. Psychologist Roy Bailey from Norwich had joined the queue.
It got darker and the snow got heavier and thicker and came down the thick blankets of snow. So there was this kind of strange experience beginning to kind of creep over me. I mean, my feeling was, I wonder if I'm going to be here for some time. I think I'm now going to be stuck here for some time.
Even by the early evening, the size and extent of the problems had not been grasped by all the authorities. While in Cambridge, traffic police simply drove home after their shift, in Essex, they were being summoned from home.
I was sitting indoors with my wife and there was a knock at the door. I think this must have been about 7:45 in the evening. And it was my inspector. He said to me, "Have I had a drink?" So I said no. He said, "Have I had anything to eat?" I said, "Yes, I've just had my dinner." He said, "Well, get your boots, because you're needed."
With jackknifed lorries and multiple accidents everywhere, the motorways had become car parks. Yet somehow this wasn't getting through to those in charge.
When I got in at 9:30, I was told that there was a tailback on the M11, as well as other problems that were going on in the county. At that time, I was told that the gritters were on their way through, and that once they had actually made it to the front, then the motorway would be opened again. So at that time, there wasn't the feeling of impending crisis. It was an issue, really, to keep a close eye on.
A close eye should have revealed that not only were the gritters stuck in the gridlock, but they had just hit upon another embarrassingly basic problem.
The central command and control radio system of this particular contractor had failed a few days earlier, and whilst repair had been summoned, it had not actually been repaired at the time. So that made communication from the gritter drivers back to the central control very difficult indeed.
The gritting problem was not lost on Freddie's callers.
Any sign of road gritting going on at all this evening?
No.
As regards the gritting, we have had reports through of gritters.
While in Essex, the chief inspector was holding the fort. By 10 o'clock, his opposite number in Cambridgeshire decided it was time to refer up the ranks. He called his superintendent.
About 10:30 that evening, I got a phone call from a person that's running the force control room, alerting me to the fact that there was significant disruption to the M11 and some of the major trunk roads running through the county, and it was pretty routine at that particular point in time.
Routine wasn't the word professional drivers were using.
I spoke to the operators of Cambridgeshire Police and told them how many vehicles and where I was and the distance of trucks and what the road conditions were like. Nothing was done about it, but they knew because drivers were telling them, and I wasn't the only one. This was the frustrating part, that people were speaking to the authorities and we were just left there.
A chasm was opening between those who were hearing about the crisis and those who were seeing it.
I had a load of these metal flasks and I had a big tier and that, obviously with boiling water. Generally as many provisions as I could carry in the back of a police car, which, as you appreciate, with that amount of people, didn't last very long.
The M11, to describe it as a sheet of ice is pretty serious, really, to be honest, isn't it?
Exactly, and it's probably not going to get any worse.
Snowbound himself, and so masterminding the Cambridgeshire operation from his kitchen, the police superintendent seemed to stay remarkably optimistic.
The situation was that we were always on the cusp of resolving it. We always had feedback that actually there's just a small accident there, and as soon as we'd cleared that, as soon as we got the gritters to this location, then we could expect that the traffic would begin to move, and that an hour or so later, a small dollop of good fortune, this situation would resolve itself.
Was something being lost in translation?
No one had the whole picture because there was absolute gridlock on the motorway. We had other problems in that the wind
chill factor was so bad that radio masts started to freeze up. Mobile phones and radios weren't working properly. When we did get through to people, we were getting broken messages.
Normally you're able to communicate with your colleagues and get some help, but because the weather was so bad and communications weren't working, that just frustrated it, and we were left very much on our own to try and do the best we could with what we've got, with very, very poor communications.
If hearing was hard, seeing wasn't much easier.
As the snow was coming down, if you appreciate, everything is painted white. I can't recognise one car from another. I can't recognise a car that I checked 3 or 4 rows back. And so it was just literally, I was either going around in circles, and I was thinking, have I just been to that car? Is that person all right? But with that vast amount of vehicles broken down, I soon lost track.
The danger of being isolated in a snowbound car was more than physical. As the night wore on, losing track of where you were could start to chip away at who you were.
Part of losing stimulation is losing a reference point. But once these reference points begin to disappear, then people begin to feel disoriented in time and space, and even lack very quickly an ability to tell the time, even though they've got watches and they've got checks for telling the time. It seems their sense of who they are begins to become a bit surreal.
And your mind just starts to wander, and you start to think about all sorts of things, you know, family, friends, things at work and things like that. Your mind is just meandering around, and all the time you've got this incessant rhythm of the snow hitting the car, just wondering what the hell's going on.
It's very weird. It's I suppose some people would say it's rather spooky. Emptiness and a little bit of loneliness, really. You just get pangs of fear.
Responding to his listeners, Freddie had abandoned his usual scripted show and turned it over to callers. The phone-in show became one of the very few places where information was shared.
The whole tone of the programme was starting to change by around about 10 or 11 in the evening. People were starting to panic a little bit. They'd been out for several hours already, but it was also the amount of calls.
I'm a lorry driver, so I have got food and a kettle and pot noodles and that, but I'm getting very, very emotional, very, very tired, and it's really getting to me now.
I was always listening to the radio to find out if you could hear any more information, really. I just imagine everybody who was out there felt the same, felt helpless, felt a little bit frightened, and the biggest fear is you brought them out here, you've actually drove them out here, what are you going to do?
As the evening wore on, Superintendent John Rain was asking himself the same question. The answer, he concluded, lay in a telephone number.
The best I thought we would be able to do would be to put a message through local radio. I actually sat here at home listening to local radio and listening to local radio bemoan the problems and so on, and yet regrettably I had actually no way of actually getting on board the programme itself. I actually sat there listening thinking there were one of these call-in numbers, and of course I could take advantage of that, but unfortunately they didn't.
Cambridge 501079. If you can update us on how the roads are looking where you are at the moment, your call will be more than appreciated. 01223 501079.
Okay, the number was out there, but maybe not so easy to catch when you're trying to deal with the biggest traffic jam the Southeast has seen in decades, and thousands of people in it who still didn't know why they were there.
Every hour I'd switch on the engine, but there was petrol was getting lower and lower, and I was getting colder and colder between each break. But then I started to get quite scared, actually. I honestly thought that people could die, that I could die. So that's when I started to think about other options.
Looked like something out of a disaster movie, really, with rows and rows of cars, lots of them with their lights out, everybody stuck, nothing moving.
It starts in your toes and it gradually creeps up your body. And suddenly I started to think to myself, well, what happens if I can't move my legs? What happens if they get so cold that if there is a chance to move off, then actually I can't react to that situation. It seemed like it was never going to stop snowing.
Snow had hit an ill-prepared southeast, and both the capital and the counties were in chaos. Roads were gridlocked, airport lounges packed.
Those that were arriving as the weather was closing in, who would normally disperse from the airport, couldn't. They couldn't go anywhere. We had people arriving at the airport who wanted to depart, who couldn't go anywhere.
With 10,000 people in the airport, Stansted had its usual number of customer service and security management staff, 6.
It was pandemonium. There was queues all around everywhere. There were people shouting.
We had the baggage dollies that unload all of your bags off the aircraft. They were actually frozen in position.
The girls on the desks, they just kept saying, we have to wait for information. We sat there, and we sat there, and nothing happened.
While Heathrow and Gatwick were struggling with epic delays, by 9:30 the staff at Stansted bit the bullet and made an announcement. No one was going anywhere that night.
By about 9 o'clock it was quite apparent that we weren't actually going to be open that evening at all. As you can imagine, people a little bit excited about that.
Oh, it was unbelievable. We were sat there thinking, well, at least we're going to get out. And then suddenly to be told, no, you're not going nowhere.
There were a number of people who you can imagine who still carry on.
There were men losing the temper, saying, this is flaming ridiculous.
I was very distraught, and I was arguing. And all the people around me were agreeing with me and were backing me up.
People just moved from that queue. Then they went to another queue where there seemed to be somebody else in some form of uniform, and they attacked this person who just said the same thing.
They were very, very lucky that there was not a scene of a riot. I was nearly arrested.
With all flights cancelled, Frances rang her husband and asked him to take her home.
He said, well, never mind, by the time I get there, I'll set out now, by the time I get there, you probably have your luggage.
But within 20 minutes of speaking to his wife, Richard was part of the county-wide gridlock.
You think, well, OK, we'll start moving again soon. There's been a crash or something up ahead of you. But then just nothing happened, and this went on and on and on.
Back in London, the commuters who had left early were by and large in the same place as those who had left later, gridlocked. Some roads had had some grid, But by late evening, they all seemed to have ice. By 10 o'clock, the streets of London had made the news.
London is almost at a complete standstill tonight. The tubes are down.
AA says that traffic conditions are the worst they've ever seen
In London, the combination of snow and icy roads has caused complete gridlock across much of the capital.
I haven't travelled very far, and I'm very annoyed. I have to go central London, so it's normally 20 to 25 minutes drive, but I'm driving for 2 hours.
London cab driver Mike had just started his shift.
It's the worst conditions I've ever driven in my entire life. It was lethal, you know, it was because of the black ice, which you can't see, obviously. You just had to tiptoe everywhere. If you speeded up a little bit, it was, you just had no chance. You wouldn't have stopped for nothing, you know?
As for the tubes, staff had resorted to an extremely low-tech way of de-icing the rails, by hand.
The scraper that you use is very much like a long wooden handle with a metal scraper on the end of it. And you physically have to scrape it by hand.
Not the whole track.
There's no good scraping for a few inches in front of the train, because all that happens is the train lurches forward and then dies.
With the staff bravely trying to resuscitate trains, Jag, 6 hours and numerous stops later, was still trying to get home on one.
I told my wife that I was hopefully going to get home sometime before midnight. You know, I'd been travelling, 4 different lines through God knows how many stations, and it was, I was pretty much fed up.
And losing hope, until he was told he could catch a bus home from Golders Green. However,
all of the London buses had been withdrawn from the area. The whole northwest London bus service was back in its garage because of the accidents and collisions that were happening.
But this was not passed on to those underground.
By this time I was just feeling so angry. I mean, did they not know that the buses weren't running that night and that the roads were completely gridlocked? It took me, 4 further hours to walk home on sheet ice. It was very difficult. I was very tired and extremely weak by then, and I eventually got home at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Sheet ice still covered the counties. The gridlock was solid. The gritting problem unresolved.
The snowplow and a gritting lorry did come down the inside, which has now got stuck completely, and a whole lot of traffic followed it, which is also stuck.
The sense I got by talking to other lorry drivers was the fact that nothing had been done. They hadn't gritted. It's the fact that they never got out quick enough, and when it did happen, they all retreated and done nothing. I think everybody thought, this can't be happening in this day and age.
It's a shame you poor youngsters don't remember men being put on the moon in 1969. Absolutely. We get beaten by 20 millimetres of snow.
In fact, the police were still trying to get the gritters to the front of the queue, but it wasn't always clear which police were directing which gritters. Gritters were answerable to each local police authority, and therefore at the mercy of the communication between each police force.
There wasn't a lot of communication with Cambridge, with different police areas. We were just trying to help the people on the motorway in our particular counties.
Finally, in the early hours of the morning, Superintendent John Rain realised he had a real crisis on his hands.
It was around about 1 o'clock in the morning that I was getting some reports from officers on the ground. I was aware of the fact that we've got an awful lot of people stuck in cars, many of them very, very ill prepared for the situation in which they found themselves. And I think at that particular point I remember thinking, okay, this is now moving into a different dimension.
Time to implement the emergency plan. This meant moving people into pre-designated resource centres. He rang his officers on the ground with the good news.
He almost felt very proud in his voice when he told me that he'd opened these up and I could get 150 people into Duxford. Of course, I had to tell him that I've got 12,000 people on the M11 alone, and there was this stunned silence on the end of the phone.
With shrunken ambitions, John Rain focused on opening up the centres for the few hundred, but even that was stretching it.
We had the county council saying, look, would you mind picking up the key holders to take them to the reception centres, because of course they can't make their way there because the roads are entirely impassable. So the solution presupposes that the police have the ability to pick up individuals and move them through impassable traffic jams to open up reception centres. Very quickly, when you begin to look at this, you realise actually this is not a workable situation. What do you do when you cannot move resources, people, food, goods, fuel from one place to another?
What you do is count yourself lucky to be stranded at the airport. It may have been packed, but at least it was warm.
This is just as though everybody just gave up. Everybody just started to lie down on floors, lie down on settees.
There were people sleeping on trolleys, people sleeping on baggage belts and behind check-in desks.
Even Ian was looking on the bright side of things.
Yeah, I was lucky enough that I'd been through into the departure lounge. I got my duty free. I got 3 bottles of wine and a bottle of vodka, and there was some good company around, so we sat around and made the most of a bad night. We were packed in like you would be, sat outside Wembley waiting for a concert.
Meanwhile, back out on the roads, thousands were struggling without the bare basics, let alone a bar.
I started to wrap myself and try and actually get a little bit of sleep in the hope that somebody was going to come and wake me up or start blowing a horn and we'd start moving again eventually. But gosh, it didn't half get cold.
By the middle of the night, given the depth of the snow and the freezing temperatures, the Chief Inspector in Essex decided on a new plan. Do nothing.
Right, at about midnight, 12:30, I realised that the gritters weren't going to get through. We'd had fresh snow, and I came to the conclusion that we were going to be stuck with the gridlock all night. The options really were, can we get the gritters through? No, we can't. Can we get people down to give them food, water and heat? No, we couldn't. Could we get them to reception centres? No, because we didn't have the transport. We couldn't say to people, if you get out of your car and walk 4 miles across the field, we hope to find somewhere for you to get shelter, because it would have been like the retreat from Moscow. If we'd asked them to walk, we would have lost people.
So while the Cambridge force was struggling with their emergency plan, Essex had already decided that the emergency plan wouldn't, well, work in an emergency.
That night, the emergency plan wasn't triggered because I knew that it wouldn't work. It wasn't whether the plan was good or not, it was a case of whether we could get the people actually in to actually implement that plan.
People now knew that they could be facing the whole night in a car. They realised it would be more than a fight against the cold.
Probably one of the great coping mechanisms that night was a form of denial, an ability to refocus and attend to other things rather than that night, so to minimize the significance of the event.
For Christine, this meant taking refuge in a bizarre ritual. She dug out her cosmetic bag and applied a full facial and manicure.
I guess everybody copes completely differently, and I think my way is just to fill the next hour, even to the point when it gets really stressful of the next minute.
The devices I used myself were, it was like juggling. I would try one thing, I would try another. I tried talking on the phone, I listened to the radio, I played some CDs. I sang to myself, I sang along with the CDs. And I began to become more withdrawn, more into myself.
With thousands of people trapped in the snow, Essex had concluded that the emergency plan didn't work in this emergency. Cambridge, however, was still trying to implement at least part of it, but it wasn't getting any easier.
For instance, you know, let's find a couple of thousand Mars bars and let's get those to the scene. But of course, you know, trying to achieve those negotiations at 3 o'clock in the morning, frightfully difficult.
Unable to move men or Mars bars, John Rain decided it was time to call the army. And being the army, they were packed and ready for action in the Gulf.
The chap I spoke to was terribly helpful and said, you know, really love to help, and ordinarily this wouldn't be a problem, but of course, under the circumstances, this is a bit of a showstopper. So I very politely asked if I could speak to somebody slightly higher up the chain. I explained the circumstances and said, look, perhaps you'd like to reconsider the position.
And he did.
From the time the doorbell rang, I knew I had approximately 5 minutes to get dressed, get out the door, and I'd say within 10 minutes I was in my phone and recovery vehicle. Vehicle started, ready to rock.
Some short time later, all of a sudden 4-tonners and 10-tonners and all sorts of military vehicles arrived.
I saw absolute chaos, basically. There was vehicle after vehicle after vehicle just lined up. People in cars freezing. I couldn't believe it. I was gobsmacked. Basically, the cars couldn't get past the lorries, the vans couldn't get past the cars, and so on, and it went back as far as the eye could see. Because only when we went up to people's vehicles that we realised there were even people in there.
Having arrived at the scene, I mean, there was no sort of miracle cure waving a wand. Now, you know, goodness me, the army are here, the problem will go away, because they couldn't unblock the blockages, and they couldn't stop the accidents occurring, and they couldn't take the place of the gritters.
Snow had defeated Britain's gritters, its police force, and now the army. It was 4 in the morning and thousands were cut off in freezing cars. Meanwhile, calls to the radio kept coming.
But I've seen one grit lorry that first of all went down here about 5 hours ago, and then I saw it coming back up empty backwards.
I'm really worried. I'm starting to panic because my petrol is running low and there's no relief in sight.
It wouldn't be until the morning that anyone knew quite how many people were there.
There are extraordinary scenes this lunchtime on one of Britain's major motorways. The M11 in Essex looks more like a car park than a road.
As dawn broke on Friday morning, it was possible at last to see the full scale of the gridlock.
This is the traffic jam from hell. Hundreds of vehicles stranded on icy roads in sub-zero temperatures with no way out.
The army had moved the most vulnerable to supermarkets turned rescue centres. The Cornell family were amongst them.
12 hours plus that we told me actually came to a stop. till we got 2 Tesco's. So it was, as you can realise, it was a relief.
People who had been trapped all night wanted to know why.
Where's the gritters? And what happened? They all knew snow was coming. I mean, it was in France, and we all knew that England were getting a bad weather, weren't they?
Days before, actually, they should be salting all the time. We don't get this trouble in Germany or anywhere else. You know, they deal with it.
But it just seems like any kind of extreme of temperature or a little bit more rain or a little bit more sunshine, and everything seems to grind to a halt.
Mike was waking up after 8 hours in his cab, his mushrooms worthless.
We still didn't know what was happening, what was going on, whether there'd been an accident or why we were still sitting there. And frustration started to turn to anger, really, as you know, it dawned on us that, you know, we'd just been forgotten about.
The pressure for someone to take responsibility was huge.
Can I say, first of all, that I apologise on behalf of myself and the Highways Agency to all of those people that have been held up and stuck in vehicles for all of those hours. As far as I can ascertain at this point in time, our existing procedures were followed by our agents.
The Highways Agency still state that procedures were followed, but accept that a crucial misjudgment was made.
With hindsight, which is almighty and powerful, of course, there's no doubt that we would have ensured that we had pre-gritted on the Thursday morning in one of those areas, as we did in every other area of the country. We reached 90% of the network before snow started to come in. However, that 10% that we didn't reach may have been the epicenter of the start of gridlock across the network.
Communications between police and highway authorities have since been streamlined, making it clearer who is responsible for what. But that morning, the chaos on the roads fueled the already difficult situation at Britain's airports. Even once the runways were clear, half the airline staff couldn't get to work because of the gridlock. Frances gave up and caught the train home, only to find her husband was still exactly where he had been the night before. Paul got home after 8 hours in his car. For Emma, it was 9 hours. Her flatmate, Christine, 20. Since that night, the police have reviewed their actions. Cambridge have reconsidered.
Yes, I would do things differently. I mean, I think we are a learning organisation, and of course we do hold a debrief, and we do look back and say, actually, that didn't work perfectly.
Essex stand by their plan.
The plan in terms of dealing with a major incident is the same as it ever was. What beat us that night was the weather, not whether it was a good or bad plan.
London Underground have re-examined and improved their emergency plans. But what about us? If there can't be an emergency plan for all emergencies, did this crisis change the way we travel?
For a while it did, but I have to say I still run too low on petrol. I now don't have anything extra in the car apart from one jumper, so long term I don't think I've learned anything.
People have often said, oh, you know, I bet you're well prepared in case of bad weather now, but the truth is after a couple of days it just drifted into my past. It's part of my life, but it's not a big part. If it snowed tomorrow, there wouldn't be a shovel in the car, there wouldn't be any wellies in there. I might put a coat in there and some water, but that would be about it. So I'm no more prepared now than I was then.
With the numbers of us travelling increasing every year, if we aren't going to change our habits and can't have weatherproof emergency plans, then maybe our ability to forget is actually a virtue.
Perhaps one of the more positive outcomes of this whole experience for people is that they're able to forget in a way. They selectively forget in a way that allows them to continue to travel the way that they would have done each and every day of the year. I think that's a kind of optimism that's almost necessary if we're going to manage to live in the kind of cultured and technological world that we've created for ourselves.